Hey everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are studying through the Gospel of Luke. We're picking up in chapter 4, verses 22 today, and we're going to go through verse 24. So just 3 verses, kind of a shorter section, but I think it'll break down nicely. If you would like a copy of the notes, same notes that I'm teaching out of, you can get a copy off of our website or Amazon.com, which I will link down in the description below. And there's just some other links and some other resources for free and some paid on our website. You can check those out as well. Let's talk about Luke chapter 4, verses 22 through 24. Let's read it first. And all spoke well of him. Well, let me talk about the context first before I read that. So you remember Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. He went out into the wilderness for 40 days of temptation, and he succeeded in not giving into that temptation. He then went up and did some preaching, and now he's in Nazareth, which is his hometown. And in our last section, we talked about how he got up on the synagogue and he read this prophecy about himself, about the Messiah. It came from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. And it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." We talked about how that pointed to the Messiah in our last video, so go check that out if you haven't already. And Jesus said that the day for that had come. When we pick up here in verse 22, we're going to talk about how the people of Nazareth responded to the claim that the Messiah was about to arrive, and that Jesus' claim that he was the Messiah. So now we can read the text. And all spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" And he said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well." And he said, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown." So we notice in verses 22 that Jesus' message was pretty well received. And that makes sense, because all the Jews would have loved to hear that the Messiah was going to come in their lifetime. I mean, that would be super exciting. They had been waiting for this guy for a long time. They had been waiting for the restoration of their nation. Jesus getting up and preaching that the Messiah was about to come, I mean, that would have been a pretty popular message. Matthew and Mark both use the word astonished to capture the people's response after hearing this. So they acknowledged the wisdom in Jesus' words, Matthew 13 tells us, but they kind of had a problem with the person that those words were coming from and who Jesus was applying those words to, because he was applying them to himself. And they began saying amongst themselves, is not this Joseph's son? And what's meant by that is, don't we know this guy? I mean, this is the carpenter's son, right? And his mother and his brothers, we know them as well. So this assumption reveals to us that these people thought that they already knew Jesus. They already knew who he was, and he couldn't be the Messiah. This was just some hometown guy, not somebody super special, not the son of a king, right? Not the great leader of their nation, just Joseph's son. But in truth, Jesus wasn't Joseph's son. And if they believe that that's all that he was, then they really missed his true identity, the identity that God had revealed to the world at Jesus' baptism, when Jesus' true father spoke of his identity, where he said, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." I can't remember if Jesus says that this is my son in whom I am well pleased, or if it is, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." No, I think that was at the Transfiguration. Yeah, I think it's "in whom I am well pleased." Correct me if I'm wrong. So they thought that they knew Jesus, but the reality is they didn't. They didn't know truly who he was. And I think that brings up a good application. We need to be careful what we assume, and we need to be careful about what we think we know without really digging down and doing the investigation. I can't really help but believe that Mary told people that Jesus was the Son of God, maybe about the miraculous conception. I can't imagine that she lied to people and told them that this was actually Joseph's son. Mary doesn't seem like that kind of a person. But how many people actually believed her? I mean, would you believe somebody if they came up and told you that story? How many people actually took the time to inquire whether or not this was Joseph's son? They just assumed that it was. The genealogy says that it was supposed, right? So what they thought they knew about Jesus was actually about to misguide them in their response to his quoting this prophecy about himself and claiming the title of the Messiah. So they allowed their assumptions about Jesus to rule him out as the Messiah before they ever actually investigated his claim. And that's, spiritually speaking, a really dangerous thing for them to do. And that's also true for us. So before we make assumptions about what we think we know about religion or spirituality or the character of God or what we need to do in order to be saved or what the book of X is about and what the main theme is, before we just assume, and because of some things we heard through the grapevine or whatever, we need to actually do that investigation, because assumptions kill people spiritually. Okay. Jesus said to them, quote, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.'" Jesus quotes this proverb, "Physician, heal yourself." Maybe this was a proverb that was kind of circulating around in Jesus' day, and I guess we kind of use this proverb today still, but it's not too difficult to try to figure out what he was talking about. So if a physician or a doctor is somebody who claims to have training or skill to assist in the healing of certain illnesses or injuries, right? So if a doctor claims to be able to heal someone of a certain ailment, but that doctor himself has that same ailment and can't heal himself, are you going to trust that doctor to heal you or your friend if he can't even heal himself? Well, obviously, no, you're probably not going to take the guy very seriously. You would want proof that this doctor actually could do what he was claiming to do. And you would assume that if he did have the power to do whatever it was he was claiming, that he would have healed himself in the first place. So this is kind of what the people of Nazareth wanted to see. Jesus had purportedly performed all of these miracles in some of these other towns, miracles that were meant to prove that he was actually the Messiah and the Son of God. So why hadn't he performed them in Nazareth? They evidently hadn't seen a bunch of these fabulous miracles, and they wanted some evidence. They might have been thinking, you can pull the wool over the eyes of these people out in these villages and these towns, but this is your hometown. Like, we know you, so you're not going to be able to pull the wool over our eyes quite as easily, because we know a little bit more than those other people. Not so easy. Now, if the Nazarenes had requested some signs, some evidence, is that a fair request? And I think, well, probably, right? I mean, if somebody comes around claiming to be the Son of God, it's okay to look for some evidence. Jesus never skimped on evidence for people who genuinely wanted to know what was right and what was wrong and what was true and what wasn't true. But I think the key word there is genuinely wanted to know. Did they have hearts that were open to finding the truth? Because Jesus knew something about this group of people that he knew something about their hearts. Matthew chapter 13, verse 58 says, "And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief." Evidently, Jesus knew that even if he performed miracles, they still were going to have a heart of unbelief. They still weren't going to believe that he was who he was claiming to be in the Messiah of Isaiah's prophecy. Excuse me. And I think this was at least in part due to the fact that they thought they already knew everything about Jesus. He couldn't be anything more than the carpenter's son, who grew up over there down the street to that poor family. They weren't ready to accept him as anything other than a simple hometown kid. And this prompted Jesus to say, quote, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown." The people of Nazareth weren't going to believe no matter what Jesus did. And this is kind of a phenomenon. And Jesus' words where he says a prophet isn't accepted in his hometown, it's kind of a phenomenon that still happens today. And it's not uncommon. You may have experienced it. And I kind of have experienced some of the side effects of this way of thinking, I suppose. When you grow up around somebody and you watch them mature from being maybe just a little child growing up into adulthood, you look at that person differently than somebody who you're less familiar with, maybe somebody who you meet in adulthood. So even when the world looks at them and sees them as an adult, there's definitely still some of that, like you still see them as that young person who they were, that not mature person who they were, and it affects the way that you view them. And sometimes we don't take people quite as seriously that we've known for their entire lives. I find that I try not to do this when looking at people who are growing up. And I try to remember that, when I was their age, my thoughts were complex and I was thinking in a way that I thought was mature at that time. And so these people really are growing up into, intelligent adults. And so I try not to look at maybe teenagers, maybe, kids that are just going off to college now that I've known since they were like 5. I try not to view them as being 5 forever. Some people that I have known in the past, especially in the church, I think they watch you grow up, and then you grow up and you get in, maybe you preach or you teach a Bible class, and yet they always look down, they always look at you like you're still that kid. And I suppose that's just natural, but there's a saying you hear people say it, that a kid can't grow up in a congregation and become the preacher, the minister of that congregation, because people just always see him as the kid. So that's kind of the phenomenon I think that Jesus is talking about here, is that these people watch Jesus grow up and they're like, nah, this guy's not the Messiah. He's just a normal everyday kid. We know his brothers and his sisters. We know his mom and dad. And he didn't get any respect from those people because they thought that they were so familiar with him. They thought they already knew everything about him. And I think that brings us to another good application, and we'll close on this for the day. And that is that the Nazarenes rejected Jesus because their familiarity blinded them to his true identity. We've expressed that several times now. So their familiarity blinded them. And now, what do we do with that in application? I think an application from that is that the ideas, that the teachings, the doctrines that we grow up with, the certain emphases on certain characteristics of God, or the way that the character of God is communicated to us, those familiar truths and traditions that are instilled in us in childhood, they create for us a picture of who God is, what God wants from us. And a lot of times it's very comfortable just to remain in that, with that familiar view of God and of the church and of religion, right? Whatever we were taught growing up. It's familiar, it's comfortable. Leaving it would be awkward and uncomfortable. So we just kind of stick with that. But we have to be careful because sometimes what's familiar to us isn't the whole picture, or isn't actually what's true. In the case of the Nazarenes, they thought that they knew Jesus. Whoops, they didn't. In our case, Maybe we've grown up thinking about Jesus in one way. It's familiar to us. We think that we know him and everything about him, and that we have a good picture of him. But is that because we've studied and come to a mature understanding of who he is and his character, or is that because there's some assumptions still lingering around, and we're just kind of banking on the fact that those assumptions are correct? For the Nazarenes, that was a super dangerous spiritual position to be in. And I think for us, even in the 21st century, it's super dangerous spiritually to lean back on a familiar Christ instead of doing the investigation to embrace the true Christ. For most of us, I think what we'll find if we do that investigation is that some of the things that are familiar to us hold true. But then maybe there's some other things that are a little bit less familiar that we need to incorporate in to get a more well-rounded view of what God wants us to see. So be wary of the familiar and be wary of assumptions. That will finish us off for today. Next time we'll pick up in verse 25. And I hope you guys enjoy your Monday or whatever day you're watching this. And I'll see you next time.